Hi, my name is Melissa Robertson, and I'm here to welcome you to this special presentation of the ESG checklist for public companies, brought to you by the Canadian Securities Exchange and Socialsuite. Over the next hour, you will hear from ESG experts in the field, that's environmental, social, and governance practices. They will detail the critical first steps that public companies should be aware of as they embark on their respective ESG journeys. As usual, if you have feedback or comments, we will provide direct links. And if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share. Thanks again for tuning in. And here's your host for the session, James Black.
Welcome, everybody. This is James Black at the Canadian Securities Exchange. Welcome you to today's webinar, the ESG checklist for public companies. Now, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. We've been talking about ESG at the exchange for several years now, and really trying to wrap our minds around what it is for companies having to comply with ESG measures or just implement best practices. So today, I'm thrilled to be joined with two people who can really help us unpack what it means to implement ESG best practices at your firm. And today, joined by Seth Forman, president at Socialsuite, also our co-presenter for today's program, and Jessica Mulholland, an ESG expert. We'll call her that today. She is an expert. And I just want each of you just to introduce yourself real quickly as to what brought you here today. First, you, Seth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Seth Forman, president at Socialsuite. So Socialsuite is a ESG technology platform designed to help public companies get started on their ESG journey. It's really built to be simple and cost-effective, ultimately helping companies to compile all their ESG information, to track the information, and report on their ESG metrics. So really excited to be here today and talk about our topic of ESG checklist.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. And we'll unpack a bit more of what Socialsuite does throughout our conversation today. And Jess Mulholland, you are an ESG expert. Explain why.
Well, thanks for having me here, James. I'm really happy to be joining Seth. And, I've been working in the sphere of climate change and environmental policy since about 2003. I've been working with First Nation, national and international governments on programmatic development of how we're approaching, the integration of sort of expanded metrics of value. And now I'm with a company called Copperleaf Technologies, and we help big organizations like utilities to plan those expanded metrics of value into their programmatic spend.
And now, I think if you read the copy for this event, 10 specific topics, we're going to go through a checklist. I'm going to make a couple of provisions here. One is we're not going to get through all 10 today in any great detail. It's simply too broad and big of a topic. So when we were preparing for the show today, it became quite clear that to go through 10 steps, 10 checklist items would be just too much. So consider this part one. And what I'm going to call this today is the awareness layer. So we're really going to focus on steps 1 through 5. And I should also note, this kind of occurred to me before we even started the show, was you don't have to do everything in this exact order. This is not super prescriptive. As you're going to learn, there's a lot of gray area with ESG still. There's a lot of things that we haven't clearly defined. So don't take this 10 steps as something written in stone. This is actually just stuff that we put together and think you can use as a guideline. So what we're going to start with today is just simple definition of ESG. So I think most people here have a baseline understanding of ESG, but I want to know, from Seth, your perspective, and then Jess, how are you defining ESG, and what exactly goes into your methodology about defining that?
Yeah, so we could jump in. At its core, and to simply put, ESG is essentially a framework designed to be embedded within an organization that considers the needs and ways to generate value to all organizational stakeholders. Now, when you break it down, the E, S, and the G, environment, social governance. Environment generally is speaking to things like your emissions, pollution, waste, water usage, general environmental-based topics. On the social side, it's talking about the people within the organization. So these are things related to, could be diversity, education, and training, any incidents within the company. So really anything that's impacting the people within the organization. And then the last layer is governance. And governance ranges from what is the purpose of the organization? Why does it exist? To different policies and procedures in the organization, disclosures like anti-corruption policies, harassment policies, the makeup of the board, items related to those. And so across the spectrum, ESG is quite broad, but the whole basis of ESG and the origins of ESG really goes back to the investor side of the house, where investors were looking for more non-financial disclosures to be able to assess the risk of an organization, to ultimately decide whether they're going to invest into the company. And so that risk mitigation tactics all relate back to these different ESG factors. So the investor side is a really key part of this. And that's generally, simply put, what we generally define as ESG.
Wonderful. And Jess, anything you want to add to that definition or some other aspects of that you want to define for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think beyond the definition of what ESG is, that at its core, it's really a packaging up of best practices, as Seth alluded to at the beginning of the hour. And the opportunity that it provides is that inside of each of these sectors, environmental, social, and governance or concepts, there's lots of play between those things. And when we capitalize on the best practice in each of those sort of pillars, we can find ways that we maybe hadn't considered running our business before, where that play in between those three pillars opens new opportunities for the business.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just a burden on the company to have to implement ESG as another, scorecard on top of another layer on top of your audit and MD&A and other reporting obligations. Again, with the view that we're talking about public companies, these companies are often just trying to survive or, execute on their business, let alone trying to keep everyone happy.
Yeah.
But this can actually open up new opportunities, and we'll unpack a bit of that as we go through this program. Seth, anything that ESG isn't meant to accomplish or isn't meant to ultimately solve?
Yeah, I think that the isn't. It's I think at the end of the day, ESG is packed in with so much positive business outcome effort that at the end of the day, the investment that an organization will make into ESG, it's as we were just saying, it's beyond just the compliance and just kind of checkbox a bunch of items. It's really that notion of going way beyond that into a whole series of different positive outcomes that businesses can achieve. And we're going to be going through that throughout our steps today. So it's really that going beyond, it's really about those positive outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. Okay, let me transition to our next point here, which is considerations for pubcos, which is basically the raison d'etre for your company, Seth, in some ways is, public companies have to meet these obligations or be prepared to meet obligations or just meet best practices. And having a software suite, having some tools to help, deliver on that is going to be key. So when you look at the issues around public companies and ESG and reporting, what do you think are the most prevalent points here that we need to consider specific to public companies?
Yeah, I think a lot of the considerations start with the why. Why is ESG important? And what are those real drivers and influences directing this move towards ESG? And so when, at Socialsuite, we talk a lot about what we call effectively the 3 C's, which are related to capital and your investor side, customers, and then the final point is around compliance. All these are really important considerations of the influences of ESG. The first one on the capital side is that when you look at the history of ESG and one of the main factors to get started is generally around on the investor side of the house, there's, we've heard a lot of different numbers thrown out there, but we generally will say, like to say there's about $10 trillion of ESG-based capital that's in the market today. That capital is overseen by a number of different funds and institutions that will look at different types of ESG-based criteria to decide where they're going to invest that capital. And so one of the main influences that we're seeing is a lot of institutional investors are asking questions and reviewing ESG information based on public companies to decide if they're going to invest. So that to be able to participate in and access those funds, you have to have ESG information. So that's a big push around the reason why to get started on that ESG journey. I think the other side of the investment house are the retail investors. And there's a lot of research showing that particularly younger retail investors today deeply care about sustainability and ESG, want to see companies that are transparent around this information, and that is very attractive to them to invest in those public companies. So you have that dynamic of the institutional and retail side of investors as part of this consideration set of starting that journey. The second area is customers. So what we're seeing, particularly over the last year, a lot of multinational companies, large cap companies, the likes of General Motors and Tesla and Marriott Hotels and name your other large cap, they're starting to form and mandate down into their supply chains to have to ask their suppliers and vendors to have different types of ESG information. They're sending questionnaires, they're mandating this, they're starting to require it. So if you're a company that sells product or plans to sell product up to these companies, ensuring that you have your ESG information tracked and reported is really important, or else it could create potential missed opportunities with your customers down the line. And the final consideration to consider is compliance. Markets around the world, governments around the world are starting to put in place different regulations around ESG. In Europe, it's already a requirement, particularly for large companies. That's going to be moving to smaller companies in the next year or two. US, Canada, Australia all have ESG in proposal stages that are very close to passing. In the US, the SEC and the state of California is expecting to pass different ESG requirements later this year. So it's really important to watch this because the compliance factor is another main reason. All of these combined are reasons why companies are really driving and starting their ESG journey and really important considerations for public companies.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. You mentioned 10 trillion in ESG oriented capital, institutions, everyone knows the BlackRock and their mandate, retail investors. So we're talking to public companies through this program, whether they're larger, most likely small to medium size enterprises, they are often looking for those retail dollars. And so what we're seeing is correlation, I suppose, to millennial investors, Gen Z investors, and ESG mandates. Is that correct?
That is correct. And even with microcap companies that I'm sure are as part of our audience, and Socialsuite works with many microcaps, what we see at that level is that even institutional investors are asking, even just from basic, and they want to see basic information that's coming out of even microcaps, because they want to have that sense of, does this management team understand ESG risks? How are they planning, even at the planning stage, thinking about these risks as they start to formulate these companies? And so it's really important to really start planning and getting that baseline of information going, because the investors are looking at it.
Yeah. Now, just I want you to weigh in on that.
Oh, it feels like a tailwind sandwich, right? You've got regulatory pressure, and that's not going anywhere. You know, this stuff has had different names over the last bunch of years, but it's all sort of heading in the same direction. And then the pressure from the public, it in my mind indicates that we're heading into a very clear direction in the next bunch of years. 2030 is like a sort of post in the sand, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I just out of curiosity, my question is, why is Europe so far ahead of North America on this stuff? Like, what's mandated there? Jess, maybe you know this better than me, but.
I mean, I don't want to step on any toes, but certainly like the diversification of the energy sector probably has a big part to play, and
Right.
and maybe just having more people in the crowd, less singular voices about how we would approach things from a fossil fuel perspective.
Right.
There's some really smart stuff that's happened over the years that's now come to fruition, and we can see the value of some of the forethought. I think about the Norwegian example of their state oil and how they planned that out with some contingency fund that was built up over time. They decided to leave some of the stuff in the ground and take it out as they got closer and closer to that peak production. And now that contingency fund is assisting them in a massive transition away from fossil fuels and towards a more diversified energy economy. So I think, it's about, a chorus of voices rather than like a really great beat. And it's also about seeing some of these practices that maybe felt a little bit askew or off the beaten path, but now are really proving themselves out as a clear understanding of those externalities, right?
Yep. Yeah. Go ahead, Seth. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to add to that where it's a really good question, James. I think, when you look back, I think a lot of it goes centers around the consumer and society. When, particularly out of Europe, the society in Europe, particularly as it relates to the climate crisis and climate change, they've been really driving this action and being at the forefront of this for quite some time. And when you look at on the regulatory front out of Europe, when the consumers and society of Europe want action and they see this as a major potential risk to society and consumers, the regulators there get ahead of it in many ways. And so, when you look at the big regulations that have come out of Europe, just not only around climate, but also around things like privacy. They were at the forefront of GDPR back in 2018. And that's driven global adoption around the world around privacy and consumer privacy. And now they've been at the forefront around things like ESG and driving that change. It started out of Europe, and now you're seeing this become more widespread and widely adopted globally. So I think Europe's at the forefront of a lot of major consumer-driven issues, and I think ESG is another massive undertaking that's being driven out of Europe.
Right. No, thanks for that, Seth. Moving along. So step number 3, sector consideration. So we've outlined, we have a clear definition of what ESG is, or at least a basic understanding to start. Then we kind of look at what are my obligations as a public company. So understanding that really in Canada, there is no obligation, noted by the CSA or the accounting standards. No one's sitting there and looking at the public companies at this point and going, you have to do this. Now there are discussions around emissions by the CSA, I believe, and there are going to be things. I think we can all agree that at some point, something's going to be downloaded, and whether it's going to be just large caps, micro caps, inclusive of everyone or not, we need to at least be considerate that something's coming. I can put that out there with a lot of confidence. Now, when it comes to sector considerations, there's no more maligned industry when it comes to ESG than extractive industries. Obviously, when you take things from the earth, it's pretty obvious that you got to replace what you've taken. And when I listen to a lot of people who are taking ESG seriously from the mining space, I feel like that there's actually a strong emphasis on stewardship and returning the land back to what it was when it was being mined. But maybe just we'll start with mining real quick, because I know it's going to be a popular topic. But is there anything, Seth, that you see or you help scorecard specifically when it comes to mining companies using your platform? Or is there something that you think they should be strongly considerate of amongst everything that's in the ESG framework?
Yeah. So when you look at mining as a whole and you break it down into your explorers, your junior miners who are really just getting going, establishing and doing a lot of different test drilling into the different projects that they have in place. You have as they move into development stage, in the permitting process, and then ultimately into production. Now, where Socialsuite sits is we work very closely with many explorers and developers as they get started on that ESG journey. And what we generally will recommend as considerations in that sector, in the explorer side, I think a lot first starts with just education. Educating the CEOs, the CFOs, the executive team at these explorers, so they really understand what ESG is, what are the risks associated with ESG, what are the important factors. And so we start with a lot of education, which is a key part of it. And then as you move into then what, I think when you look at local communities, which is really, really important for explorers, how are you engaging with your local communities? And also, what do your local communities care about as it relates to ESG factors? And then how are you communicating to them? What information are you providing to them? So there's a lot of ESG inherently involved in that process that should be considered. And then you also have that basic information starting to pull together your baseline ESG metrics, what disclosures you already have today, what don't you have. And we're going to be getting into a lot of the specifics associated with getting started in the probably the part 2 of our sessions. But I think that the pulling together that basic information and how you're going to respond to those local communities are a really good place to start.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, Seth, I'd say too that the mining sector has a long history of understanding the implications of not identifying that risk at the start of a project and having, some really deep implications in the cleanup. So I think this is pertinent very specifically to the sector, but they end up being forgive the pun, please, a canary in the coal mine, because we've also seen some instances where working with Indigenous land keepers can help those industries to make way better decisions about how they're handling, the biodiversity impact of their operations. Even, there's the knowledge that's kept in communities where people are living close to the land is incredibly valuable at a societal level, at an environmental level. And so growing our companies to not only understand and make space for that because it's the right thing to do, but also to engage those folks as partners. In the Yukon, we've seen some really incredible examples of First Nation governments taking place and helping those companies to increase their profits from the work that they're doing. And that benefits the community, it benefits the company. So it is the right thing to do, but it's also good business.
Could I add one other thing? And I would say another misconception that we hear in the explorer stage sometimes is that investors aren't looking at ESG even down to explorer level, because explorers don't have a lot of ESG data yet. They're just getting going. And that's a real misconception, because when we interact with investors of all sizes, they expect that explorers are going to at least have that basic level of information. These are mainly public companies. They have a lot of disclosures that are associated with ESG. It's just scattered everywhere. So it's really that notion of, investors are looking at this. They want to see these management teams starting to factor in ESG as part of that process. Because when you start, even at that stage, when you're starting to incorporate and embed ESG in the organization, even at that early level, it ultimately will be embedded throughout the company's entire life. And so that's really important too. Yeah,
there's so much to learn along the way.
Yeah. So what's more opaque for me is, things like computing, where you have an industry like the blockchain sector, where the whole thing was driven by how much computing power you could, contribute back to the chain. And that would require huge processing power, which would require cooling, electricity, and actually, would seem pretty damaging to the environment when you consider how much this thing escalates pretty quickly to get the computational power. So I guess my point is mining is pretty obvious. You're going in, you're digging stuff up, you're going to have to replace it. You're going to have to work with the locals. When it comes to computing, and we're talking about AI, and NVIDIA now is, I think, $1 trillion market cap. It's going to be creating, a gazillion chips in the next few years to back the AI revolution. Do you guys have any thoughts just on computing and how that sector in technology has to play with the ESG framework, or is it stand outside of that because it's doing such good work?
Yeah, no, I think the key thing is ESG really is agnostic for any industry. We work with computing, software companies, technology companies, biotech, crypto. It really runs across the board. And when you think about it from a sector level, when you're just getting started, it's pretty much that path is fairly similar across the board. It's pretty seamless. Now, when you go in deeper and you go into more advanced levels, let's say, of ESG, there are some very specific sector level metrics that you should be incorporating into your process. But that's at those more advanced levels. When you're just getting started, it's really fairly seamless throughout, which is that educational levers, the idea of what is material to your organization, what are those main risks and opportunities, what disclosures do you already have, and formulating that foundation, and it absolutely can exists across any sector that's out there.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to throw a quick airball here. We had a question. In the end analysis, what body designates a company as ESG company? So I guess the question really is, are we getting rubber stamps from someone saying you've met the ESG criteria, you did it, now go get them? Like, is there any way that we're going to get to that stage? I put up a previous question here that says, in Canada, we don't even have a standard. So I guess in your minds, how do you define the standard for ESG compliance or ESG success?
Yeah, it's a good question. Any company can go on that ESG journey, right? And I think it's really about what actions are you taking, what are you tracking, what are you compiling, what are you reporting on to go on that journey. There are a number of different types of frameworks that are out there that as you complete the framework, you can say that, hey, you're compliant, or you're certified with the UN Global Compact, or you're certified and you've completed the framework for the World Economic Forum Stakeholder Capitalism Framework, or with the SASB framework. So you're effectively associating your organization and aligning it with a ESG framework, which shows that you're on that track. There are also a number of different ESG rating companies out there that some are very well known, like your MSCIs and Sustainalytics, that will give ratings to certain companies, generally larger companies that are, in the market caps are generally in the multi-billions of dollars. And they're also in a way providing an ESG rating. But it's still in the ESG in general. We're still in the early days of this. It's still going through an evolution of how it's being defined, where is it going, and it's also consolidating, and that structure is still developing, and so we're still going through that process. But it's a very healthy process, an important one, as the industry ultimately just gets to the point which is, what is great ESG, what is not great ESG, and how do we get there? And that's still that process that we're going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was just at a climate leadership conference in LA a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how difficult that is, right? That there isn't a single standard that we can look to and we can compare each other across. But as Seth mentions, I think that's evolving, and I would point anyone who's sort of lost in the alphabet soup of those different opportunities. I'd point to the task force on climate disclosures. That's a great place to start. And I think a lot of the standards that are coming out are sort of benchmarking themselves to that set of requirements. And then it's also helpful, if you are in a specific sector, you can look around at what your peers are doing, because eventually the hope is that we will be looking at each other across, a specific sector. And so it can be very helpful to benchmark with your peers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was listening to a podcast with the head of IR, one of the IR people, VP of Investor Relations for Equinox Gold. And so if you're a smaller explorer or smaller gold producer in general, look at Ross Beatty, look at the companies he runs, look at the things that they're doing. They're larger. It's a $2 billion market cap company, but look at them and try to model some of the things they've done to integrate ESG into their business. And they will say everything that you've already echoed, Seth and Jess, about its risk mitigation, its best practices. It's actually better for the bottom line if they do it right, because it takes a lot of risk out of the equation as they progress their businesses. So yes. Okay. Now let's move on to the next portion of our discussion, which is building buy-in. And this is if these topics seem broad, it's because it is broad. I mean, you're talking about a potentially transformational exercise within your organization. And so when you try to build buy-in, Seth, I think I know where you're going to go first with this one, but building buy-in for a public company, where does it start? Where do you have to go to get the company on board with an ESG mandate?
Yeah. Buy-in is so critical. And, what you really want to see in organizations is that in many ways, it really needs to be a top-down effort. And top-down can come either what we've seen, it can come from the board, where at the end of the day, a board is there to mitigate risk in the organization to ensure that the organization is compliant and on the right track. And so boards are sometimes at the forefront of ESG that are driving that down within the organization at the executive team level and into the organization. So that board buy-in is really important. And then in parallel, the executive team, ultimately starting with the CEO, that really sees the value that ESG in their organization can have, both in the current form today and into the future state of the company. And so the buy-in at the executive team and board is critical. And that once that's established, then really driving that home and executing on an ESG plan and setting those ESG goals becomes much more consistent, and you can really deliver that ESG initiatives because you have that buy-in both at the board and at the executive level.
Do you agree, Jess? Is this a top-down exercise at organizations, or is this something a little slightly different?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly can be, but I think the successful versions that I've seen over the decade or two that I've been watching have come from, all over the organization. And I think that's where we're getting to. We're starting to evolve these things out of the silos of an environmental department or like a social justice department. And we're starting to move these principles into the way that we value our company. And, that's the reason why I have come from environmental policy and landed at Copperleaf, because we are working with very big organizations to organize the value system around your strategic objectives as a company. So what do you think is important inside of these three things? And how does that translate into every single project that you're doing? So enabling your teams with tools to be able to understand, I'm just replacing this boiler, but it actually does have an impact on my E or my S or my G metrics. And that's something that you can do as the thing evolves. That's probably not in this early stage or for a smaller company, but those tools are out there. And as we start to ingest and engage our whole team on the principles of this sort of strategic opportunity that comes from ESG, that evolution will come to fruition.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I also note that with teams and buy-in, we're going to transition to that in a second, but talent acquisition. I mean, if you're an organization and you've got sort of this mandate or this publicly stated standard, and you're actually following through on it, it's not just talk, that will probably lead to better acqui-hire or acquisition opportunities for organization for talent, because it's alignment, right? It's just same principle we talked about earlier with investors. So talent creates great organizations that create value. That value in turn creates returns for investors. It seems to be a nice little circle you can build with this thing. So let's
James,
get to that next topic. Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Can I comment on that real quick? Because it's a great point. I go back to a story with one of our customers, the small cap on NASDAQ, and they were, talking about how the CEO jumped into ESG initially for the investor, to get in front of investors. But what they learned is that once they went through that process, they released the report, their actual main stakeholder and the biggest beneficiary of it ended up being their employees, where it helped them with recruitment, retainment. They do this annual release to their internal teams every year and gets everybody really excited and understanding transparently what the company is doing across these different ESG initiatives. So it's a really key point. The employee base is another real beneficiary of this.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring that into focus here with building your ESG team. So using sort of the examples that we just presented, building an ESG team, again, this is not just a board committee. This might be something broader, but in your experience, Seth, how are you seeing public companies build a team philosophy or a team concept around ESG and implementing that into their business practice? Yeah.
It's an important one, as an important step as well, and I think a lot of this depends on the size of the organization. Generally when we're working with more of your microcap, going back to like we were talking about explorers earlier, that have maybe between 5 to 10 employees at the entire company, then what you're really looking at, that initial ESG team, it's generally going to be driven out of the CEO or CFO level, and also the board, and that becomes your initial go-ahead team, where it's tasked across those different specific stakeholders to go through the ESG process. Now, for a bit larger organization, we generally will encourage there to be a single project owner, where there's somebody specifically tasked with driving the ESG initiative through the company from start to finish. And that person will then have to effectively quarterback and bring in other layers within the company, whether it's legal or HR or the other executive team or the board, to continue to execute against the ESG plans. We've also seen at a bit more sizable companies where there'll be a task force that's encompassed, an ESG task force that will have different representatives from different areas of the organization. So you're getting a mixed and a more collaborative approach, and also inputs from a lot of different people and divisions in the company as part of that ESG initiative. And so we've seen a lot of different ways that the team is built. It really depends on the size of the organization, and also the I guess how broad and comprehensive an ESG effort is being made within the company and how many people are involved in that.
Jess, what have you observed in the world of team building and ESG mandates?
Yeah, I mean, I think of this as a long game. And so I think wherever possible, if you're growing capacity inside of your team and inside of your organization, that's going to benefit the business across the board, and certainly benefit the ESG objectives.
Yeah. And having a champion, I mean, do you guys foresee at some point, a chief ESG officer is a job title at some of these organizations? I mean, it seems like at some point you need someone, as you say, to be the central, person. And it can't be the marketing guy. I'm the marketing guy at CSG, and I don't think that's a good example.
No.
I mean, we see, that's the challenge, James. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest obstacles that companies that we work with face the micro caps, the small caps, a lot of mid caps where they don't have a chief sustainability officer.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have ESG, dedicated ESG expertise in-house. And so then it gets tasked down to the investor relations lead or the CFO, sometimes even the CEO or someone else in the company. And so they're being asked to take on in itself its own job to go and execute against an ESG strategy. And that's really hard. And it's really hard. And that's where ultimately leveraging partners, other service providers, and other companies that can help you go through that process, particularly for those companies that don't have internal teams, is really important.
Yeah, I'll throw another question here. Would it not make sense that at some point the respective exchange or exchanges CSC to facilitate an ESG designation? Probably not. And I mean, I'll say this, like a lot of our regulatory compliance in our model is based on basically deference to what's existing. So national instruments, accounting policies, accounting rules, corporate securities law, for us to come in and be, a singular voice around what is good or bad ESG or what should be designated as an ESG compliant or not, it would take us probably out of our lane as to what we're good at. And again, unless it's something built for the entirety of the public markets, I don't think that's going to happen without consultation with our competitors, with the senior regulators, with other lawmakers. And so I don't think in isolation it adds a lot of value to the end investor if we are the ones describing what's good ESG. So hopefully that answers that question. But yeah, I said there's some socialization here on the chat. That's a good idea. I mean, I would like to work with a Socialsuite or Copperleaf and try to work towards, pushing companies towards some sort of uniformity or, as we have an index and you ascribe value, say, hey, this is companies in the CSE 25 or they're a senior tier issuer because they have a certain market cap size. That stuff's very quant based, is very clear. And then when you get into the very qualitative world of ESG, it becomes a much different animal. So I appreciate the energy around that question, though.
I don't think it's going to take too long for us to start seeing those regulations come through. Like ISO expects to have one this year. The market will provide us with those directions. Certainly, we've seen lots of direction from independent or individual regulators in the energy sector. So I think it's coming.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I'm going to put the next step, but I promised everyone on the show today that this was going to be sort of just the awareness layer episode, and then we're going to get into deeper details around integration, gap analysis, and all that. But I'm just going to add, basically as a tease for part 2, identifying your gaps. So Seth, now that we've kind of gone through this awareness layer, just to remind everyone what that actually looks like, identifying the gaps. Really, really quickly, how do you start that process?
Yeah, so when you think about, and this is very much aligned with that, where do you get started with ESG? How do you get started? And one of those first steps, and let's start with a misconception. One misconception we hear a lot is that I don't have any ESG information. I'm starting at zero. And if you're a public company, you're definitely not starting at zero. You're starting, and what we've found is that a lot of companies will have a couple disclosures at minimum that are related to ESG. Some companies are 40, 50% of the way there in terms of all of the ESG criteria. They just don't know. It's scattered in 10Ks, it's scattered in annual reports, it's scattered in your own employee handbook. It's just all over the place. And so as it relates to identify the gaps, it's really that first step, which is running a very quick analysis of what ESG metrics and disclosures do you already have. It's been approved generally by your board and executive teams. Let's bring that together and look at where you stand today in terms of your progress as associates with against an ESG framework. We generally will recommend a good starting place for microcaps in particular is the World Economic Forum stakeholder capitalism framework, because it's really simple. It's just 21 metrics across people, planet, prosperity, and governance. And it gives you a very quick way to just kind of see where you stand, and align with a very simple framework. And then you can understand what you don't have. And so that's that really first step of really running what we call gap analysis of what are the metrics you have, what you don't have. And that's one of the good starting points for any company.
It's a juicy spot, right? You get to get in there, right back to those opportunities. Oh, we weren't even thinking about that. And now here's this like door that's opened in front of us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's, you see a lot where executives are like, oh wow, we're really on that track. I didn't know that. And it's kind of that starting the engine, and then you're off on the race.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a really important step.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I don't want to get too deep into building the plan. But what are some of the tools people should consider when getting to that stage?
Yeah, I think building the plan is really the once you have your gap analysis, we recommend also what's called a materiality assessment. Simply put, a materiality assessment is a survey that you send out to different stakeholders, your board, your executive teams, sometimes your shareholders, and you're understanding, what is most material to the company from a risk and opportunity standpoint. Is it environmental risks? Is it more of your social risk or governance risks or opportunities? That really helps you, that the results from that survey drive your plan, because that helps you prioritize what are those most important risks and opportunities associated with ESG, and then combined with knowing what ESG gaps you have, that should drive your action and help you set goals, help you understand, what framework should I align to, how do I drive towards my baseline. So all those things are really part of that building plan, step 7.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say that this is the point where if you're a larger company, there's a lot of value in looking at your strategic objectives and finding the places where your ESG plan can align to those strategic objectives, and where expanded metrics of value can really drive home that opportunity piece, where you can grow business benefit from the work that you're doing around ESG.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to leave that as the tease for part 2. As you can see here, there's implementation. Implementation would be, it's a monster, and it's probably its own episode. So we'll leave it at that. But and then measurement, and then scorecarding. It's all part of sort of that implementation. And again, now that you've had the awareness, you've started analyzing what you have to do, you integrate, and then how do you know that you're doing a good job? I mean, yeah, maybe your stock price goes up, but what if it goes down and you're still set on getting those ESG measures scorecarded positively without direct correlation to profit? I think that's when the real conviction has to come into play, right? Which is, we've done all these things, we believe firmly in it, but I'm not seeing correlation to stock price. Well, maybe that wasn't the motivation to start with. But again, it can be hard when you go to your board and you go to your team and you had that buy-in and you go, we've doing all these things and it's costing us effort, and it's not resulting in anything that you can directly see in the performance of the company's financials. So maybe we'll leave that as a tease for the next episode, because I think that's when the tough questions start getting asked, is when it doesn't seem to be working. So I'm going to bring up a couple of people to add to our conversation. We've got a team behind the scenes here at the CSC that is Melissa Robertson and Dimitri Giller. And I asked everyone at the start of the show today to complete a survey. And so what we're going to do here is Dimitri's going to share some of the survey findings, and then Melissa's got a few Q&A questions that she's gathered. But Dimitri, what did the survey tell us today? What was the gist of the survey, and then maybe what can we share about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll run through the survey, highlight some of the top answers that were selected. So kicking off the first one, where are you on your ESG reporting journey? And happy to say 44% are over 12 months.
Oh, wow.
And so great result. And even more exciting is 0% stated not considering at all. So So great outcome there. Yeah, high fives all around. Okay, next one. What would motivate you to start or speed up your ESG initiatives? Going down the list, 44% regulation or compliance. It's a big one. And second place is investor pressure at 33. Those are the two heavyweights there. Next, what value are you looking to derive from reporting on ESG? Big one, 55.6% stated regulatory compliance. And second place, risk mitigation.
Right.
And
For sure.
20%. Okay, who's the primary decision maker within your organization to adopt ESG reporting? Another 56% said CEO. And
Awesome.
tie for second is CFO and board. So
Not the guy down the hall who just got hired. Really keen on it. Well, that's good. That's a good sign.
All right. Next one, which of the three pillars, of the ESG pillars, is currently the main focus for your organization? Environment is at 67%. So big majority there. Second place is governance.
There was an interesting note in the chat there. Someone mentioned, the E part is the easiest part of the ESG to track. And I think it's so on the nail on the head, right? Is we know how to do those metrics, but starting where we are and adding on to what we already know we can do is a big deal. So just starting somewhere, getting that E underway, and then a lot of the S, the social factors I've noticed have come from environmental justice questions. I'm seeing a lot of companies are layering their sort of geographical information so that they're understanding different implications about product or about investment in different social areas and that sort of thing. So I agree that there, E is the easiest, and it makes sense that we're starting there. We've had a lot of time in on that. But it's like the thin edge of the wedge, and it helps us to understand, again, back to those expanded metrics of value, how we can really settle ourselves into measuring the social impact of our work.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dimitri, didn't take away.
No worries. Feel free to jump in if anything really pops out here.
Well,
a couple of more left here. Who's the main audience for your ESG reporting? And clear winner here is institutional investors, 55%. And second, third is regulators and customers. Tie between those two. And okay, are you experiencing investor or supply chain ESG pressure in your markets? No clear winner here. I think it's a three-way tie actually between investors, supply chain, and NA. NA has a little bit of a lead there, so not no pressure. So coin flip on that one. Yeah.
That's interesting, actually.
Yeah. Okay, and last but not least, what trends do you think will drive ESG in 2023? And big one, new requirements and compliance for ESG reporting. Again, above over 50% stated that one as well, and then the rest are just kind of tied in between. So
after all this, people are still kind of being if I were to translate that, are still being told to wait, or waiting for something to be told to them, I should say, to comply with.
That's right.
So, on one hand, I can't blame them because why take on work that you're not willing to do, or able to do, or able to focus on when you have all these other distractions and mandates. I get that, but at the same point, I think we've identified that the money is starting to clearly drift towards those who do have these mandates. So waiting for the rules might be too little too late.
Yeah, there's an element of influence too, right? The early adopters, those first folks at the table, are going to help those regulations to form, and the availability of data. It's part of how regulators are coming up with these standards. So it isn't to your detriment to get started early, I don't think.
Yeah, and I would also add that it's, this isn't a 2-3 month checkbox exercise and you're done, right? This is easily, could be a 1 to 2 year process, and that's just to get going. And then it's an ongoing effort. But there are ways to do this in a simple program, so it's not a distraction to your core business. So you can do your day jobs and ultimately keep driving and growing your business. But the companies that are just going to keep waiting, keep kicking the can down the road, and then waiting for regulations to change are going to be at a massive disadvantage when it's going to become a huge distraction to the company if you're planning on waiting this out. And that's why it's important to get started today, so you can go through and educate and get that foundation built, plus to get all the other really fantastic positive business outcomes for the company.
Thanks. And thank you for that, Dimitri. Melissa, you've been patiently waiting to ask questions that have been fed to you by the audience. What did you hear from the people? What do they want to know more about?
Well, one of the things that I think we haven't talked too much about today, and perhaps this will happen more in the second part of this webinar, but Seth, can you talk a bit about greenwashing and what that looks like, or the definition of that? How are companies avoiding that, or unfortunately participating in it?
Yeah, so the greenwashing is generally defined as the notion of misleading the public, misleading consumers based on certain ESG information. And so, you're starting to see a lot of, scrutiny coming out of regulators from this. There's companies getting fined because of greenwashing. You're seeing more public-related greenwashing, scrutiny coming down on certain companies. And so, no organization wants to be labeled as greenwashing. It's obviously a very bad PR publicity if that's ever named for your organization. So the question of how do you ensure that doesn't happen? Pretty simple. Make sure that if you're making any sort of public commitments or public disclosures related to ESG, you follow through on it and you deliver it with a plan and set goals. The ones that just say, hey, we're going to be net zero next year, and there's no plan, there's no goals, there's no information about it, that could get you into that greenwashing bucket, which is not good.
Yeah, and these things are harder to accomplish than they seem from the outside. That's why getting started early with as much as you can is the best way to go. We're starting to see litigation now around greenwashing, so it's no small potatoes. Like it's important that if you're making a commitment to a target, that you're actioning that commitment.
Jess, earlier in the conversation, you were mentioning the year 2030 as a benchmark in relationship to ESG and best practices. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been posting different information for a long time about the implications of the warming potential of the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And I think this post in the sand that I mentioned at 2030, it's sort of the last moment that we have to make a real impact. And then we start to have to shift from mitigation into adaptation. We're going to see the effects of those risks start to really push and come into our business in a way that we have to respond to. We don't necessarily want that future. So the 2030 goalpost is a collective effort. We have to work very hard on the mitigation. And I'm speaking very specifically from the environmental side of this ESG connotation. But that 2030 milestone, a lot of companies have set net zero targets for 2030. And the point is that mitigation potential is excruciatingly important in front of 2030. After that, we're going to have to be in a very different zone.
Thank you.
Any final
I have one more question.
Cool.
This is I'm gonna try and pronounce this correctly, but what is a materiality assessment, Seth?
Yes. So So materiality assessment is, I think as you look at ESG in general, and if you're a company that really hasn't gotten started yet, the materiality assessment is a really great place to get started, because what it is effectively a survey, and it's a survey that's going to usually go out to your board, your executive team. You could also include your employees. You could include stakeholders like even your local communities we've seen this sent to, or shareholders. But the survey encompasses a set of questions related to ESG topics, both from a risk and an opportunity standpoint. And you get all this data back from your respondents that help you as a company directionally decide what are the biggest priorities that you should focus on as part of your ESG effort. What are the biggest risks? What are the biggest opportunities? Is it emissions? Is it related to diversity? Is it your community relations or biodiversity? So it helps you really align on this and then prioritize what you want to do as part of your ESG effort and where you want to prioritize your organization's time as it relates to your ESG effort. So it's a really, really good place to start. And there's a lot of both vendors, including Socialsuite, and other resources out there to help educate you on how to go about a materiality assessment.
Good place to end it. In fact, I've got one more plug. I got to offer here, and that's the Summit on Responsible Investment. This is an event we're hosting in Kelowna, and it's going to be on June 27th, 2023. So roughly a month from now. I'm going to put a link in the chat in the notes below, but the Summit on Responsible Investments, basically just what you heard today throughout an entire day. So ESG topics, companies, thought leaders. I'm sure Seth is going to be there. Jess, I'm hoping you're going to be there. And this is an event where we can bring all these ideas and learnings into practice in person throughout a full day agenda. I can't go through it all now because it's too big, but I encourage you that if you're in Canada and the West Coast, it's a quick trip to Kelowna on the 27th of June. Come meet us and participate in this event. There'll be public companies there too. So you can actually hear firsthand how some of these issuers are meeting all these obligations, or at least striving to be good ESG citizens. So I got to thank everyone who participated today. Seth and Socialsuite for co-presenting. Jess, thank you for sharing your expertise. It was huge value add today. And then Dimitri for facilitating our survey, and Melissa for all the great questions and all the support. I'm James Black. I work at the Canadian Securities Exchange, and I want to thank you, the viewer and listeners to this. If this is coming to you through the podcast, that if you have any questions, just give us a quick shout. You can email us at media@thecsc.com, or myself, james.black@thecsc.com. Maybe Seth, just tee up what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, James, for inviting myself and Socialsuite to participate today. It was a lot of fun. The best way to reach me, my email is seth@socialsuitehq.com, or you could go onto our website, socialsuitehq.com, and hope to hear from any of you soon.
All right, Jess?
Yeah, I just popped my email address in the chat there. I just want to say thank you so much. I'm really delighted to see the CSE hosting this webinar on ESG. I think it's a really important thing for us to be talking about very publicly and very widely. And, you know, I would just leave by saying that we're all history's actors, and ESG is really our opportunity to be creating the best businesses that we can, that have the most longevity possible, which is good for us. It's good for the world that we're creating together. And yeah, just really proud to have been here with you and Seth. So thanks.
Awesome. Okay, well, on that amazing note, thanks so much. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you at part 2 at a to be determined time, but you better believe it's coming. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Ciao.
Right,
Thank you.